Now live. All right, mic check. Looks like that's working. Might need a little more volume. Hold on. I don't know why the volume changes when I never change the dial. Okay. Tonight's discussion, fishing at the coast. I just got back from the coast and I have a good bit of experience fishing over there, but actually pulling gill nets over there. For those of you who don't know what a gill net is, Frank, what's up, man? I don't think Rudd's going live tonight, and I'm going to be busy on Sunday, so I'm going to go live tonight. Hope I'm not blocking on Rudd. If I am, we'll cut it short. He's usually on for a couple hours, but I checked, and he doesn't have anything scheduled. He usually does, so he might be fishing or doing something else. But I just got back from the coast. My sister was in town for a couple days. They got a place rented over in St. Augustine. So before I left here, I checked the tide charts. And I wanted to talk about, how I checked them, what I was looking at and how it related to scientific sampling that I've done. How's my audio, Frank? Is the mic's not? It should be going a little bit higher than this. I don't know. Should I be closer to it? No, it's still not doing it right like it normally does. Check. I don't know. It usually, it's getting there. Check. It's still doing the same thing. Sounds good. Thanks, Mike. Okay, cool. I don't know. I'm going off it's like an EQ thing. Like it does like a stereo equalizer. And if you get closer to it or further away from it, I don't know. So anyway, I have, oh, that's interesting. Emblem. Oh, I bet that means you're a member, isn't it? That's cool. And thanks to Dexter's Lure Lab, man, he gifted 10 memberships last week. And I saw him do it again on Serious Angler podcast too. So Dexter's the man. Maybe some of those dudes will come through. Maybe they're out for Friday nights. Who knows? 4 people in there. Welcome, everyone. I just got back from the coast. I was over at St. Augustine. And I was visiting. My sister's got a place on the Intercoastal she rented for a couple nights. And I went over there to visit with them mostly. But before I went, I checked the tide charts to see what was going on. So I wanted to talk about that, show you what I caught fish on, in case you go to the coast. Maybe it'll help you out. And I get my experience. I'm not like a great coastal fisherman, basically kind of a bank fisherman. Although I've found a couple places that you can really do well from a kayak, in a couple places in Florida. And one of them is over there by St. Augustine in the Intercoastal. The waves aren't too bad over there on the backside, not on the ocean side, in the Intercoastal waterway side. It's like kind of like a river. It can get rough in there too, but anyway, wanted to start there and then we'll see how it goes. So back when I first got out of school, pretty much the best biologist I've ever worked with. Well, he's probably tied with Brian Simmons over at Owen and Williams, but Tony Dodd. I got hooked up with Tony in my mid-20s when I had just graduated from Georgia. And let me expand the screen so there's not a bunch of distractions. All right. So we would get, we had to do testing of fish tissue. And back then, there were problems like discharge problems from industrial sites, paper mills, and shoot, I don't even know all the places that we worked. Come to think of it, it was a lot of paper mill work, and the EPA requires anything like a nuclear power plant will take water from a river and use it like a radiator, basically, to run into the system to cool the place off, and and then discharge the water, back into the river. And since they're using public water in that manner, the EPA requires them to test the fish tissue to make sure there's no contamination for anybody who's eating the fish back there. So it depended on where it was and what you had to sample for. You had a list of certain species of fish you had to catch, a certain number of those fish. They had to be a certain size as well. It was all very technical. So a lot of the sampling was it was done with electrofishing boat in the freshwater parts of the rivers. Like we work the Savannah River. And for you guys who aren't familiar with the Savannah, it runs like between Georgia and South Carolina and runs southeast along that border all the way to the ocean. So there's a lot of paper mills there. There's a lot of old power plants there. There's a lot of there's just a lot of industry along that river, old and new industry. And that's generally where you find actually the new industry stuff is so regulated that you don't really have too many problems with contamination. All the fish that we sampled back there, none of them came back hot for any kind of like don't eat the fish type contamination. But once you start getting into brackish water and into the salt water, the electrofishing boat stops working. You can't use it in it doesn't work at all in pure salt water, and it just depends on the flow of the fresh water coming in. If the fresh water is not flowing real hard due to lack of rain, then the salt water encroaches up the river further, and the electrofishing boat won't work. It literally just shorts out because the salt water is too conductive and it just shorts the system out, and the electrofishing boat doesn't work. So once you get to the coast, you're not using electrofishing boat anymore. So it's a different process you have to go through with the state, and you have to get permission to pull gill nets. And gill nets are entrapment nets where the fish they look like that. There's usually 3 layers of monofilament lines. Some of them it's big triangle, some of them medium, some of them small. But fish really can't swim backwards. So they hit the net and they panic that they're getting trapped, and they drive their head into the net, and then those triangles entrap them around the gills. And that's how you have to sample salt water, because like I said, the shock boat doesn't work. What's up, John, man? Just got back from the coast today, and I just caught 1 fish, but I only fished for a couple of hours. But that's what I want to talk to you guys about in case you ever go over to the coast, or you're fishing freshwater that's tidally influenced, like the St. Johns River behind me will be tidally influenced. And it's important to understand the tides and how they work, because it's really weird, especially once you get into that, pure salt intercoastal waterway. It works differently. And I saw guys today like fishing at the wrong time, and we walked a pier, we did some sightseeing, did a little shopping, because I checked the tide chart and I knew when to go fishing, when my best opportunity was to go fishing. And I know that from pulling gill nets, because when you put a gill net out any fish that passes by that 300-foot net gets ensnared in it. And so if you don't fish your nets the right way, you don't catch any fish at all, even though you have the most effective form of, capturing fish in saltwater fishing for you. You can zero because you didn't set the nets right. So I wanted to review that with you guys, and then anything else that pops up tonight we can talk about. But today, just use today as an example. Dead low tide was around noon. So, and I'm just going to be generally speaking, because tides are kind of weird. Like, it depends on where you are and how the areas flood due to the tide. So we're just talking kind of in general. But I looked at the chart and I knew dead low was around noon. So that means about an hour before 11 a.m. and about an hour after to 1 p.m. That's when the tide is really, really low. Like it's kind of it's not all the way at dead low at 11, but it's really pretty much got there. And then at noon, from 11 to that 2-hour window, and today it worked perfectly in there. It was dead. I mean, it was just flat low and calm and no water movement, and you can see the bottom out there. You don't want to be fishing in that window an hour before dead low or an hour after dead low. And the same thing would apply if it was high. An hour before dead high tide and an hour after, the water's not moving. So today I knew it was low at noon. And we went like in the morning, we went and traveled around, touristy stuff, looked at stuff, checking out shops and stuff. And I just told the girls, I said, we need to be back at your dock. It was just a little dock behind the place they had rented. Just up a little finger, a lot of grass in there, but I was just fishing from the bank. I said, we need to be back over there by about 1 o'clock, 1:30. And the reason being is that's when the flooding tide is going to start coming back in. It's going to start moving. So there's about a 3-hour window in there, usually from 1 to about 4. Because if it's dead high at noon, it'll be dead low at 6. So at noon, and then at 1 o'clock, by 2 o'clock, the water starts to flood again. And that 2, 3, 4, 4:30 window, when the water's coming in and flooding hard, right? That's when you want to be fishing. You want to be fishing when the water's moving. And you can pack it, just like I said, you can't catch fish in a gill net in that window I just described, that 11 to 1 window. You can put nets out, you can do whatever you want. You're not going to catch any fish. They're gone, right? And they're out deep because the bait's out deep. But as the tide starts bringing the bait in, what happens is the bait stays in the edge of the shallow, as shallow as it can. A small bait, the shrimp, the crabs, everything is running. It's trying to get to the grass. It's trying to hide. It's trying to find the cover, and the fish are right behind it. So at 2 o'clock, it really started pulling. It worked kind of right on the schedule that I'm accustomed to. And 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, that was the 3-hour window that you wanted to be fishing. And it was about the 3:30, 4:30, up to about 5 it ran. It ran pretty good. And then once that water is up into the grass, like once you start seeing it get into the grass, all the bait is going, again, it's following the edge of the water. So it gets up into the grass to the places that you can't catch fish anymore. You can't cast in there, but the fish follow the bait right up into that grass. So it's that little window when the water's flooding and it's not quite in the grass. That's when you want to be fishing. The flooding tide tends to produce better catch rates in gill nets and with hook and line than the falling tide. But you still catch good fish on the falling tide. I'm not saying um, like today, it by 4:30 or so, it was pretty much over with. So from 5, it was dead. 6, it was dead. 7, it was dead. And then about 8, it's going to start pulling back out. So about 9 o'clock tonight, 10, 11, as the tide was falling, you'd want to be fishing again. And you can pretty much set your clock to that. You don't, when you go to the coast, don't fish all day long. Pay attention to those windows. Pay attention to the tide. So that's exactly what I did. I just walked out onto the dock, and you could see the fish start coming in. You start to see some small fish start coming in, and then you start seeing, like I saw a shark go by. Actually saw a manatee in there. But then you started seeing like the sheep's head came in there and started getting on as the barnacles, as the oysters started getting flooded, the sheep's head started coming in there and feeding around on that. And then you started seeing the red drum coming in. And I threw jig heads at, I mean, the bucktail jigs in there at them. Some jerk bait type baits, saltwater, like Yozuri type baits in there at them. Didn't get any luck. That's right, Mike. Slack tide's a good time to go to lunch. That's exactly right. So you could literally see the fish in there where we were at, because we were really way up into a finger where there was mostly grass, and it was just like little patches. I only had about 3 places that I could cast in there, but I did end up catching a couple small redfish. And the lure that I wanted to show you, this is it works really good in the Gulf. It's called a Paul Brown, and it's got a rattle, and it's got like a lead. It looks like, I don't know, it's some kind of harder core, but it's soft plastic, right? It fishes pretty much like a super fluke. It's got a little bit slower rate of fall, but that's what they were on, and that's a good redfish bait when the drum are around. That Paul Brown, and like I found that one for a couple bucks in like a discount bin at one of the bait shops the last time I was over there. So keep an eye out for the Paul Browns. They're a funky. Again, it's pretty much like fishing a super fluke. It's got a little bit more fall to it, but you will get some left and right with it. And I'd say it was, I don't know, maybe 3:30 or 4 o'clock. The water was flooding in there pretty good. It wasn't quite into the grass, just barely into the grass, maybe that much. And the redfish had snuck in. There's a little patch of grass right in front of me, and I was working that Paul Brown on the edge of that grass, and then I'll put a picture of it on there. It wasn't a big red drum, but again, I wasn't even fishing from a boat. I was just fishing from the bank off the dock. And the fish just lit it up, and I had a few other bites, caught another small one. Didn't have any live bait. If I had some live bait, I might could have got on a few sheep's head, pretty nice sheep's head that were in there feeding around. I wasn't expecting to see them, but there were oyster bars in there, so they come in there and feed on that. But I don't know, it's just really important if you're at the coast to pay attention to that. And then the second thing to pay attention to, it's not much different than bass fishing. If you can find where the water channelizes and pulls harder, like a river, and deeper. And especially if it around a bridge, if it channels down around a bridge and there's rock around that bridge, and you get a lot of strong current, that just instantly jumps out at me as a good place to fish from the bank, on vacation. If you're just chilling out, you don't want to go fishing all day long at the coast, because there's so much dead time around the high and low tides. You can time it in that little 3-hour window and just go whack them for 3 hours, and then go back to the family and go do what you wanted to go do. Just pay attention to when you need to be fishing. And like I said, today, dead high, our dead low was 12. So I was fishing by 2 and I was done by about 4:30, 5 o'clock. Didn't really, but again, it's right in the strength of the tide. When it was moving is when I was getting the most action. And just by knowing that, you're not killing the whole day. When you go to the coast, you're really just fishing for about 3 hours and take a break and then come back for the next 3 hours, on the falling tide. And that'll help you a lot. I almost always catch fish at the coast, just by doing that. But again, it goes way back to when I was fishing with Tony. We would put our nets out in that slack tide from that 11 to 1 period. We would put the nets out. We would let them fish from like that 2 to 5 period. And then once that tide got up and got high, we'd start pulling the nets and collecting the fish, putting the nets back out, and try to work up all our nets while that tide was slack, get all the fish out. And then once the tide started coming back out, they're fishing again. So we would get on a standard work day, starting in the morning. It depended on how the tides fell, but you usually get like, the flooding tide and then the ebbing tide, or is that the right word? The falling tide, whatever. You'd usually in a 12-hour day, if it was timed right, you'd get to fish the nets and catch the fish twice. And like I said, that's the only way to catch them. If you tried fishing the nets at the wrong time, you could put them out, let them fish during the slack, and you won't even catch them in a gill net. So like today, you could see it. Like you could see the fish just feeding all around. But then once there was about, that much water up into the grass, and also you could see the birds would be at the edge, but then they'd start moving back into the grass and into no man's land, basically. And that they're showing you where the bait fish are, where the crabs are, where the shrimp are, where the small bait fish are, up in the woods, basically. But I don't know, like I didn't get skunked, at the coast, and that was cool. Had a good time and just fished for a couple, 3 hours. I wish I turned the air conditioning on in this house. It's hotter than crap in here. But it jacks up the audio with the air running, so I'll keep it quiet and suck it up. Have you guys had similar experiences at the coast that way? You understand how to fish the coast that way? I know Frank's probably in the middle of Canada and nowhere near the coast, but I would imagine the Great Lakes would fish exactly the same way. Oh, and another thing to watch for too on our reservoirs, the ones that they generate for power. Big Malone, what's up, my man? Welcome aboard. Just talking about fishing at the coast and fishing how to fish the water movement. But like there was this reservoir out near Athens, Georgia, where I went to college at UGA, and it was called Lake Oconee. And I was in a bass club in college, and 2 years fishing in a bass club, pretty much. Well, I didn't feel like fishing like that anymore. I like to fish just to fish. I don't really like competitive fishing, or just the whole thing is not for me. Southeast Georgia kayak. I can show the questions because I was smart enough to put this on StreamYard today. Yep. Yeah. It again, and that's a good point. Southeast, I'm giving generalizations. The tides are weird. And it has to do with the terrain on the bottom and how the flooding goes. Uh, I was really close to the beach. I mean, literally just, a couple hundred yards was the other side of the beach. But if you're way inland, it can be different, you know. But it's just important to understand, excuse me, that the water movement and when the water's moving is when you want to be fishing. And I heard the guys at the Elite Series in Palaka. I mean, even though Palaka is like probably an hour and maybe a half to run out to Jacksonville, even running on the water, you'd have to run like hell to get there in an hour. It's a pretty long stretch up to St. John's to get all the way to the coast. But even out here behind the house, there's guys setting crab traps. There's guys cast netting shrimp in Palaka. It's pure fresh water, but it's a unique kind of a situation where you've got saltwater fish in there. Anyway, back to the point of Lake Oconee. We would go pre-fish for the tournaments on Fridays. And I usually did school, and whoever I was fishing as a non-boater. So, um, I drew a boater every week and generally I could get out of going to school and would just go do a pre-fish tournament. And Lake Oconee was real close. But the pattern you notice real quick out there is Monday to Friday on Lake Oconee at the dam. And Oconee's not big, like 10,000 acres. They generated for power. So they open up the bottom, it turns the turbines, spins them up like an alternator, generates electricity for the surrounding area. That's the primary use of that lake. And a lot of our lakes in Georgia are that way. There's a lot of power company type lakes like that. So when they opened up the dam and started generating for power, it created flow through the lake. And as soon as they cut on, the fish would start biting. And as soon as they cut off, the fish would stop biting. And it took me a couple trips over there to figure it out. Probably one of the older dudes pointed it out to me too, because I was just a kid, man. I was like 20. I didn't have any big lake experience like that. So Monday to Friday, so you're pre-fishing on Friday, right? And and then all of a sudden, you start catching fish and you're on certain lures or whatever. So you think you're all ready for, the tournament the next day. Some days we'd have 2-day tournaments out there. But on Saturday and Sunday, when the tournament days are going, because there was so many, the public was using the lake and the river behind it, they did not generate for power. So everything you learned on Friday didn't apply on Saturday. And a lot of times, you'd have 18, 20 pounds on Friday and go out and absolutely skunk on Saturday because you had to fish the lake completely differently. They weren't moving the water. You can do it at Lanier too. Pay attention. Even it's 28,000, I think. But when they open up the dam and start generating from power, there's a number that you can call, and they'll tell you. And there's a river behind Lanier that people trout fish in. They blow horns back there to get people off, because when they open up the dam at Lanier, the river level changes back there like 8 feet. If you're caught in that river, you're going to drown. You don't stand a chance in there. So they warn everyone, and there's a phone number that you can call to find out, when especially if you're going to be on the trout side of it, down there on the backside, you got to get off the river. You're not allowed back there. It's just too dangerous. It's just too much water flow coming through there. It's ridiculous when they open it up. So if you're on the lakeside though, and they're opening it up at 2:00, I don't even worry about getting to the lake. I'll be cruising into the lake about 12:30, putting the boat in, having some lunch. I'm not going out there early in the morning I will wait until I know they're about to open it up. I want to be on the water when they're opening up the dam, and that will usually fire the fish up. And again, just it's not 100% by any stretch of the imagination. You can definitely go out there and catch fish when they're not generating. But if I had my choice, and probability wise, you want to be there when the water's moving. And you'll find that I don't know what it is. It's just I guess it's instinctual, but they'll fire up when the water moves. Fortunately, back here behind the house, Rodman's 10,000 acres, and they do jack with it. It's not a power plant uh, kind of a lake, and they don't have a number here to tell you when they're messing with the water. But the nice thing about it is like when the water's dead calm, it's pretty much like a river back there. The flow is pretty constant back there. If you can figure out when they're dropping the water down, and they only pull a couple feet of water out of the lake, depending on what's going on. No, Southeast has got a point, but I want to make another point against that. The oxygen levels won't change very much when the water's flowing in reservoirs. The oxygen is derived, and actually, Dexter came through, and we had a good conversation about oxygen. We can talk about that. He was talking about barometric pressure changing oxygen levels, and that's one of those things where, yes, it is true. It does, but I looked it up after the podcast last week was over with, and the pressure changes they were talking about, they were comparing like lakes at sea level versus like lakes up in the Rocky Mountains or high up in the mountains. The pressure changes there would be like 1 to 2 parts per million difference in oxygen. So if you're talking about a lake, down like where I'm at by sea level, and you get a barometric pressure change, is it going to shift the oxygen level? Yes, a little bit, probably not even measurable. A couple of tenths of a part per million, the point I'm making is I don't think you're going to see a fish kill due to a barometric pressure change. You'll see a fish kill due to a turnover where you've cooled the surface of the water off to the point where it mixes with deeper, colder water. You'll never have turnover problems in like Rodman. If the lake's too shallow, it won't even really stratify. Between the flow and the shallowness, there's going to be oxygen top to bottom in there all the time. You won't have turnover issues. Turnover issues are going to come from really deep lakes where you've got this much light penetration, and then a huge deep level of unoxygenated water down below the thermocline. So you've got this warmer level water with less volume where the plankton can live, and a higher level of water down here where there is no light penetration, so there's no plankton kind of generating oxygen down here, and it's a higher volume of water because it's a really deep lake. And you also have to consider all the stuff rotting on the bottom is consuming oxygen. So you've got no light penetration. You've got no plankton down there really doing you any good. And you've got bacteria down there that's taking oxygen out of the water. So that it's called a hypolimnon, epilimnon up here, hypolimnon, thermocline is the line that draws that between the two. When this level of water has more volume of this and this, the only thing that keeps these two levels separate, it's like a cake, like a layered cake. And the icing in the middle is the thermocline. Oops. So when this unoxygenated level volume is higher than the oxygenated level, and the oxygenated level gets cooled off by a rain, that causes those two layers to mix. And if that happens in the summertime, because this warm water holds less oxygen, it'll kill the fish due to oxygen depletion. And even though a weather front, the barometric pressure would change that, if it doesn't turn the lake over, the barometric pressure is not going to drop the oxygen level enough to kill the fish. At least I've never seen it. So your oxygen levels are produced by the plankton during the daytime, and flow will help stabilize those oxygen levels. But you have to remember, it's like, and well, again, this is all highly technical and I'm generalizing a lot, but the flow isn't going to super saturate the oxygen level very much. It's going to be what it is pretty much, whether, especially in lakes. In rivers where the water's really flowing, that's a different scenario. I'm talking about lakes right now. The photosynthesis from the plankton is going to be your primary driver of the oxygen level. And if you've got, I don't know, 6 parts per million and it starts to flow the water, maybe it goes to like 6.1 parts per million, or you stop the flow of the water, maybe it goes back to 6 parts per million. But it's the flow isn't going to change the oxygen levels usually enough to kill the fish or hype the fish up. One thing we can see in a pond, I've seen it many times, you can get supersaturation of oxygen where, like, if you look at the book, and I don't know the numbers offhand, but let's say 88-degree water can hold 6 parts per million oxygen, or 6.5, something like that, probably maybe 7, but let's just say it's 7. And you go to the pond in the middle of the day, say it's like 1 o'clock and the sun's up and it's a really sunny day, and you look at the book and you say, okay, this temperature water should hold 7 parts per million oxygen. But you put the oxygen meter in the water and it's holding like 8. Okay, that's super saturated. It's holding more than what the book tells you that it can hold. Now, here's the interesting part. The reason why it does that is because there is no waves. It'll be really calm water on a day like that in a small pond. And say you have an aerator in that pond. Well, what's making that water super saturate is the surface tension. The surface of the water isn't being broken up by the wind or wave action or anything. So the oxygen level will super saturate. And I've seen this. We did it in class. All right. So we put that in there and everybody said, okay, it should be like 7.1 parts per million based on this temperature, but it was like 8.1. It was like a full part per million higher. Turned the aerator on, broke the surface of the water up, and it dropped the oxygen level down to where it should be, because when you break that water up, you broke that surface tension, and basically the supersaturation caused the oxygen to release into the atmosphere. So it's a situation where running your aerator in the daytime can decrease the oxygen levels. And that's one thing that dudes, like, it just goes right over their head, but I've literally watched it happen. Again, all, like, I'm summarizing a lot, and I'm definitely no oxygen expert, but I know I've watched it in small aquaculture ponds. So we recommend in your pond just to run your aerators at night for that reason. The plankton will produce way more oxygen than any bubbler or fountain or aerator that you can put in there. And you're kind of just wasting your money running any kind of aeration in the daytime. If you're going to run aeration, I would, if it was my pond, I'd run it from about, I don't know, depending on, how much money I'm spending. The most important time is that last 2 hours before the sun comes up. That's when your oxygen levels are going to be the lowest. So that's when you want your aerators running, and you can run them all night. If you can afford the power bill, just run the aerators all night, but you don't have to run them in the daytime for that reason. Yeah, that's a good point, Southeast. That's kind of what it is. It's like as soon as they turn on the power, the generator, and the water starts to flow, it just triggers them to feed. And it's not an increase in oxygen that's triggered them to feed. It's literally the water flow that's triggered, just like the tide. And honestly, I don't know why. It's just a pattern I've noticed a couple billion times. Um, they just like flowing water. It just fires them up. I don't know. Maybe there's another biologist has seen some research on that. Maybe there's some new research on that. I never saw anything in school, but I'm far removed from school. Maybe there's some new studies, so if somebody comes through, finds a study, I'd be interested in knowing. But I just know that when the water's moving, the fish will start feeding usually. And that brings me to another point. I was watching the Serious Angler podcast the other day. Stephen Barden was on there, and I like listening to Stephen because he's a biologist like me, but he is with like MLF, and he messes around in the management of bigger bodies of water. And he made a really interesting point that I never really kind of drew the connection to. So talking reservoir management, talking pond management. Reservoirs are man-made lakes. Ponds in Georgia are all man-made. You can definitely get north and find ponds in the glacier type parts that are natural ponds. The only natural ponds in Georgia are called oxbow lakes, where there was a river, coming like that, and then the river changed course and kind of left. The river no longer flows through there, but leaves like a ponded area. That's actually where the world record was caught, was in an oxbow. Those are the only natural ponds or lakes in Georgia. Everything else is man-made. So when you think about that, if you catch a bass from a pond or from a reservoir, that's not a native fish. That fish didn't evolve there. That fish was stocked there by biologists from a fish hatchery. And whether it's a northern strain, especially if it's a Florida strain outside of Florida, that's not a native fish. At least the northern strain type fish, if it's an F1, that's not a native fish. But if you go back, I don't know, maybe 50 years before they built all these reservoirs, maybe 60 years. Some of them, like I think Santee Cooper was impounded in the 30s. So getting close to 100 years ago, some of those lakes were built. But none of those fish in there are technically native fish. They were stocked. So taking that fish and moving it to a river, especially if it's not one of the rivers that's feeding that lake, you're changing the genetics, because the northern bass, before they built all those lakes, basically evolved in rivers. So taking a fish from a pond or taking a fish from a reservoir and putting it into a river is significantly changing the genetics of the fish that evolved in that river. And that's bad. Like, it gets back to go look at what spotted bass have done. People have moved spots all around, and it's ruining spotted bass particularly are bad. But even if you look at just simple genetics, taking a fish from a pond or a lake that was stocked and moving it to a river is diluting the genetics of the fish that evolved in that river over thousands of years. And, that's bad, because I personally believe the native fish for the area are the best fish to have for that area, right? We don't want to be moving fish, from a hatchery into a native population unless you're a degreed biologist and you're breeding fish, you're using the native genetics, which is what they do usually. They know what they're doing. And these guys who are bucket biologists who are moving bass around, especially spots. And I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I posted that picture of a spotted bass, and I got 8 different answers on what kind of fish that it was. And it's like that if you can't even identify the fish, you should not be stocking fish anywhere. And hell, it's really hard for me to identify all the fish. Especially in Georgia, there's every species, I think like 12 different species of bass in Georgia. I think we have the most diverse bass populations, um, all kinds of species of fish around there. So they can be really difficult to identify. The smaller they are, the harder they are. They can be hybridized, which makes it even more difficult. And you really have to be an expert at identifying fish. So what it comes down to in the post that I've been making, just don't move bass anywhere. Put them in a cooler, fillet them, have a nice meal, have a nice free organic protein meal. You haven't ruined the lake. All this misinformation about catch and release. Man, I'm taking a beating on YouTube right now with the video I did with Rudd, and we had all those fish in a cooler. Like some dude came on there and was like, "You need to have your fishing license revoked. You've gone way over the limit." And I'm like, dude, this is private land and this is America. The state laws do not apply here. I don't even need a fishing license to fish here. As a matter of fact, take my fishing license from me. I could give a rip. Public water sucks. Most public water bites it. Like you guys don't even know what good fishing looks like. You can take every public lake and go flush it down a toilet for like give a crap. It is nothing compared to what you'll get out of like a 30 to 50 acre private lake that's been stocked properly. It will blow you away, the fishing. You'll be pissed off if you leave and don't have an 8-pound fish after the third year. Like you catch 8 after 8 after 8 in a good managed pond or small lake. It's easy to catch fish out there. It's stupid. It's like Mexico, it's world-class bass fishing. And these public reservoirs with every jackleg throwing, competing fish in there and moving fish around in there and just doing all that stuff is what's messing it up. And then they're pointing the fingers at the biologists for mismanagement. But really, moving all those bass around the way these guys have is the problem. That's what's keeping the biologists from being able to do a really good job because they have to manage around idiots who keep moving fish around. All right, let's check some of the questions. 10 folks, welcome aboard, everyone. Thanks for joining all right, natural state. The AGFC is draining a local lake for dam restoration. And you're looking forward to the new lake effect. I like the way you think, natural state. I like the way you think. Now, pay attention because I've seen some dudes, like there's a place called Bear Creek in Georgia. It's about 750 acres and it's just outside of Athens. And the politicians went in there and they did all this big talk about how, it's one of those places where you can only fish like Wednesday to Saturday. It's closed most of the week. And it was going to be this big trophy. The guy even went as far as to say is they're going to be growing world record. That's their goal is to grow world record bass in there. And, man, I don't know what they did. I wasn't part of it. The only thing I know is after about 5-6 years, I went over there fishing and it's just stunted to hell and back with peckerheads. And then I got to talk to the biologist and there was existing lakes in the bottom of that 750 acres. There were other ponds and lakes that were in there that they did not drain. They left those places intact. They left the fish in those places and they filled it back up. And it stunted quick and the place is trash. Now, that's not to say you can't go over to that 750 acres and catch a good fish every once in a while. You can. And that tricks guys into thinking that, it's a great fishery. It's not, because a 750 acre lake stock right should be cranking out fish like they did it right at Bussy Break, that 1,200 acres over in Louisiana that they drained down. The MLF in 4 years, they're catching 12-pounders. Guys are coming in to weigh in 2 10-pounders on a 4-year-old lake. That's what you would expect. Bear Creek never did that. They had a couple decent years of fishing, and now it's just stunted to crapping back. It's actually more fun to go out there and catch the hybrids than it is the bass, because it's just 12-inch bass all day long over there. They did not do it right. So the same thing applies in ponds. I've seen guys do it in ponds where, oh, I'm draining my pond. Okay. Well, I drained it down and there was only about a half an acre left in the bottom, and then we filled it back up and stocked it. You didn't do it right. And your fishing sucks now. Probably is going to suck worse than it did before you drained it, because you didn't do it right. When I say drain it, I mean drain it dry. The Sahara Desert. If you don't drain it dry, you better drain it to puddles, and then you better treat those puddles with a product called rotenone. It's a ground up plant, South American plant called a dearest plant. And when you put that powder in the water, you don't want to breathe it. You got to be very careful with it. It's very dangerous. What it does is it goes into the water, it attaches to the red blood cells in the fish, and it replaces the red blood cell. It replaces the oxygen that the red blood cell can carry, and it literally suffocates the fish. You have to go treat all the puddles. You have to get all the fish out of the bottom with treatments if you can't drain it dry. If you don't do that, and you don't do that right, and it can be incredibly difficult to do that right. That's another thing guys think. They think you're going to drain the lake down or the pond down, and then it's going to take 6 years to fill back up. Usually it's more like 6 days to fill back up. Especially the smaller the pond, the faster it'll fill up. And it depends on the watershed of the pond and how much is being fed down to the pond. But generally the problem in Georgia anyway, when you drain a lake or a pond, it's not the amount of time it takes to fill back up. It's, can you get even enough water out to do the job properly? And that's where they screwed up at Bear Creek. They didn't drain enough water out. They left full lakes of fish in there. And so what happens is they had adult bass, we'll call adult bass bigger than say 10, 12 inches, somewhere in there. That's big enough to spawn. So we'll call that an adult. So when they went back in and stocked all their fish fry, because that's the only thing they can afford to stock on 750 acres, you don't have the money to stock that thing with adult fish. You got to stock it with fry. But you already got 12-inch bass in there. They absolutely smoked that fry and shift it to bass heavy instantly. And that's exactly what happened to him at Bear Creek. And Bear Creek kind of sucks. I don't like fishing over there. I quit fishing over there because it was just like fishing one of these stunted ponds, just catching peckerheads all day long. Dinkathon. So just because they drain it doesn't mean they got to drain it, and they got to do it right. If they do it right, 3-4 years from now, it'll be incredible fishing. If they do it wrong, you'll know it because it'll suck. Josh is writing in. Let's see what he's got here. Tennessee. Pools with largemouth spots, smallmouths, swimming and grouping up. See, now you're getting into like, when you've got that many different varieties of bass too, that makes it even more complex. And I can promise you the spotted bass will spawn with a smallmouth bass. You'll get mean-mouths for a few years, and then those mean-mouths will spawn and it'll revert to spotted bass. And then generally they'll outcompete the largemouth bass, and you'll end up with a whole lake full of 1 to 1.5, maybe 2 pound spots. And they don't get any bigger than that. Occasionally you'll catch a, 4 to 6 pounder, you go 15 times and fish all day long, and you might catch one in, a field of 20 boats. Somebody will pull one decent spot. It's not like Lake Lanier where you crush them. But that's just how it is. Let's see what we got here. Natural State. Yeah, dude. provided they do it right, that's where you're going to want to fish, you know, and generally they do. You know, I have seen them screw it up. Those guys drop the ball at Bear Creek like big time, right? But generally those guys do it right, and generally like that's where you're going exactly where you're going to want to go. You'll be busting PB after PB, 4, 5, 6 set years, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Yeah, it will be incredible. Let me scroll back up, make sure I didn't miss anybody. Hello. It looks like we're all caught up. But yeah, New Lake Effect is incredible, dude. Like it's stupid. Well, you'll get growth like we're getting at Sugar Hill Outdoors, you know. Probably 2.5. It depends on the species of fish they stock. If they stock F1s, you can get 3 pounds in a year, and the density at which they stock them. And that's another part too. It's like one guy was telling me, well, I've got Florida bass in my 20-acre lake that are, you know, 5.5 pounds in 2.5 years. And I'm like, really interesting. What stocking rate did you put those in at? Oh, 20 fish per acre. Oh, well, yeah, well, no kidding, because I stock 40 fish per acre in Sugar Hill Outdoors. And there's a reason for that. I'll drop as low as 35, but I want the pond to be a little bit bigger than 2.5 acres. 2.5 acres is easy for birds to prey in. It's easy for otters to prey in. Having a few extra bass per acre. Like I said, we still got plenty of good growth at 40. If it gets over 10 acres, I'll drop it down to 35 and really get like you can get at 35 bass per acre, you can get bass over 12 pounds in 4 years. F1s. If you're doing Floridas and Northerns, you're not going to get that kind of growth, just like we're seeing now. We're getting a couple pounds a year. And we might see by the end of this year, we might see some of those Northerns jump up to like maybe 8, 7.5, 8. They're transitioning into bigger forage in there, but they still don't grow like F1s. So, you know, the genetics of the fish matter a lot when the pond is balanced. Now, the genetics of the fish don't matter if you overstock them initially. I've seen guys do that a lot. You know, they'll go in there and they'll hammer it with like 100 bass per acre and then sit around and scratch their head while they're not getting the growth that, and it says in the book, you know, you can stock 50 bass per acre in an unfed, unfertilized pond and 100 bass per acre in a fertilized pond. But what these guys don't realize is that book information comes from like the 1940s. And in the 1940s, there wasn't anybody considering that people were going to throw every single bass that they catch back. As a matter of fact, it was the opposite. People were harvesting bass, everything they caught. So that 50 to 100 bass stocking rate by year 2, probably half those fish had been removed. Once they hit a pound in a year, those people were putting them in a cooler, right? And you were getting reproduction to replace it, but you were getting constant harvest on the lakes. And I noticed real quick, you stock 50 bass per acre, they don't grow as fast. Going back to the point that I was going to make, though, yeah, you stock 20 bass per acre, they're going to get phenomenal growth. As a matter of fact, the guitar player, Derek Trucks, he's got a lake like that. I went and did consulting with him. He's got all female Florida fish in a 24-acre pond that are growing like freaks. But you know what his complaint is? He never catches any fish. They're only stocked at 20 bass per acre. You're going to go fish 15, 20 times and skunk before you land one at rates like that. So it's called CPUE, which means catch per unit effort, or how many bass you catch per hour. And that's why I go to that 35 to 40, because I'm getting really great growth, but I'm also getting a high CPUE. If I drop it down to 20, yeah, I'm going to get better growth, but it's not a fun place to fish. Like, you got to be a pure grinder to go in there and catch fish. And that's what I mean, and that goes back to the point of guys saying, well, I want a trophy bass pond. Okay. And you want them to grow as fast as possible. Okay. There's a significant difference between stocking 40 bass per acre and 35 bass per acre in your catch rates. Right. It gets way harder because there's fewer bass per acre. You drop it down to 20. Yeah. You better be born again hard. You're going to be getting skunked a lot. Those bass are so well fed. It's just and so keyed in on natural. There's so much natural bait that they're not chasing. They're not out there feeding. They're so well fed that they're really keyed in. And at 20 bass per acre too, you really like to see a diversity in the forage base as well, because you can get a little bit, like, you want shad in there, you want bluegill in there, especially on like a 20-acre lake. I like to see a little diversity in the forage. You'll get a little bit better catch rates with diversity on a pond that size, just based on my experience. I don't have any scientific proof or a study. I'm just going off like what I've seen before. And then in your smaller ponds, you can have a really good diversity. You can have thread fins, you can have bluegill, you can have fathead minnows, you can have all those kinds of things, and you can stock them at 35 or 40 bass per acre. But if you fish the pond too hard, you put a lot of fishing pressure on it, you train those fish up real quick, and you get the exact same problem where you go fishing all day long and don't catch anything. They've seen all the lures. They don't fall for them anymore. If you stop fishing on your pond in that situation, give it a month off, they'll forget. But just like the feeder comes on every day. 5-10 minutes before the feeder comes on, the bluegill are moving towards it because they just instinctively know we're about to be fed. Let's go over by the feeder. Turn that feeder off. That's really bad for the pond. You never want to do it. It's just significantly dropping the carrying capacity when you do that. But if you were to turn that feeder off for long enough, those fish will forget anything you do to them every day or every 3 days, And that's why public water is harder to fish too. It's getting a lot of fishing pressure. They're seeing every lure 10, 20, 15 times, it's like a day. It's like when there's so many, like Lake Lanier, where there's so many fishermen showing them every single lure that Bass Pro ever made. There's actually studies on that. And the studies that I saw were like, it was like, all right, so say like Sugar Hill Outdoors, you stocked 100 bass and you go fishing. About the time you catch 100 fish is about the time your CPUE starts going down. Like, you start out catching like, say 5 fish per hour, and you fish it every single day, and you get to that 100 fish mark. And then after that, the CPUE goes to like 3 fish per hour. And if you keep fishing at the same rate, it drops to 1 fish per hour. Like, you're training them not to bite when you fish them real hard in a pond. They figure it out. They don't like being caught. They learn. And we're going to start seeing that. Like right now, all these guys are freaking out about forward-facing sonar. You don't have to freak out about that very much longer. As more guys add forward-facing, as more guys start using forward-facing, as more guys start training those fish with the forward-facing, that crap's going to stop working. Oh, Natural State's coming through with some more information. Let's see what we got. It's 200-acre lake. Yeah, 200 acres is about the point where crappie are okay. You'll sometimes you need crappie in a lake that size. And crappie can be difficult to manage in a lake that size because they'll be inconsistent and you just got a lot more diversity in there. They can be inconsistent spawners. They're really not inconsistent spawners in ponds. They really cause problems in ponds. I never put them in lakes really under 100 acres if I could help it. You don't really want crappie in smaller bodies of water. They don't do very well. They usually stunt and then take over, and you end up with like 80-90% of the population with terrible looking crappie, and then the other 10% is just the other game fish. But yeah, 200 acres, you usually don't have problems with crappie. And then if they drain that lake and start it all over again, with or without crappie on 200 acres, it's going to be solid. Oh, that's a good question, Josh. You don't want to be fishing bigger lures in the first like 2 years, right? Not to say that the bass won't be, you couldn't catch a fish or two on them, but as the bass's mouth grows, right? It starts out like in year one, it's a 1 pounder is going to have a mouth like that, and then a 2 pounder is going to have a mouth like that, and then once it gets to that 3-4 pound range, and you start getting a mouth about that size, that's about the size. Any fish that can fit head first into a mouth like that, which is about hand size, right? That's when you're going to want to bump up to the bigger lures because they can actually consume them. You'll see that about year 3 is when I'll really start cranking. I usually, like in my ponds, I usually don't even really fish them for the first 2 years. I just kind of let them go. Again, I don't want to train the fish. If you can leave them alone and not be, and most people can't. I've had a few places like where the land was huge and they had multiple lakes, and it's just like, all right, let's fish that lake or pond and then leave this one alone for a couple years and let the fish grow up. So in that year 3, year 4, where they've seen barely any fishing pressure, oh my God, it's beautiful. Big Malone's got one coming in here. Let's see. Smaller 75-acre lake. You go 7 times in skunk, and then you catch an 8 or a double digits the 8th time. Yeah, that sounds like a lower bass population. And now on a 75-acre lake, that's probably coming from a crappie population, or it could be a green sunfish problem, but there's something in there that's reducing. It could be just like habitat, like you don't have like the good habitat to hide the baby bass. So crappie and green sunfish or some other kind of predatory fish can get in there and really work the bass fry over. And it's lowering the catch rates. But what you're describing right there sounds like a lake that's got about 20 pounds of bass, or 20 bass per acre, or could be slightly lower than that. It's exactly what you see is skunk, 8, 9, 10, 13, every once in a while, like just a huge fish comes off. It's got gizzard shad. And no bass are allowed to be kept. Yeah, I wouldn't want to keep bass out of that lake. The bass that you got there are in low numbers. So yeah, I wouldn't want to, especially a big one. You wouldn't want to keep anything out of a lake like that. And usually on 75 acres, it'll pretty much stay like that. And it's the gizzard shad. And, you've probably got just massive schools of big gizzard shad in there. And the bass that are lucky enough to survive, probably the crappie predation or the green sunfish predation or both. Once they get over that hump, they're fewer in numbers, but they have plenty of huge forage. And then they just explode with growth and run up to that 8 to 10 pound size class. You'll see northern bass do that. It doesn't have to even be Florida bass to get to that big in a low situation like that. but that's a real common pattern you see on. I prefer those lakes. I mean, those are the lakes. That was Commerce Reservoir, where I used to fish in Commerce Reservoir 51. If you guys are Georgia guys, um, it's behind the old Atlanta drag strip. The drag strip's closed now, but I've gone 20 trips and zeroed. I mean, not even a bite. And then, ease out there one morning, throw the bellows gill up on the edge, move it twice, and you catch 9.5 pounder. I don't mind that because I've caught so many 1 pound bass. When you've got 2,000 acres of water you're managing and 1,900 of it is bass heavy and it's all 1 pounders. I just get so tired of catching 1 pounders. I don't want to catch them any damn more. And I would rather go skunk 10, 15, 20 times and then catch a really good one than I would go catch a bunch of small ones. Now, there's a lot of people who are the opposite, and then that falls into two. You got to understand, when you're managing public water, most people would rather catch more small fish than one big fish. They don't have the patience to grind it out like that. So the biologists have to keep that in mind. And they have to manage the fishery for what most of the public wants, not what guys like us want. And they have to manage it at a higher catch rate. And when you manage it for a higher catch rate, you're managing it for a lower average bass. Nose is itching again. Freaking whatever. Autoimmune issues are kicking up again. Let's see. You seen bass? It's a Yakub. Is that how you say that? Yakub says he's seen bass corral bait fish just like herding dogs. Yep. Pressing them against the bank. That's another reason to watch for the ledges, the steep places. You'll have bass. You'll have bass that'll orient to the ledge, and then generally what'll happen is the bigger bass will be suspended on the ledge or suspended somewhere, on that area, and then you'll have the smaller bass, like the probably 2.5 to 4.5, 5 pound bass. Largemouths anyway. They'll tend to, they'll be more pack feeders. They'll figure out, hey, we're young, we're fast, we can swim around in school, and we can push these schools of bait fish into those ledges. And especially too, then if you have lakes with like striper or hybrids, they're doing the same thing all the time. The fast movers are out there just giving the shad the blues, man. They're not giving them a break. So those schools of shad are real active when you have striper or hybrids in the lake, and pushing them into the ledges or up into the shallows. Sometimes you'll see that happen too. But yeah, they'll definitely shove them around and to put them into a position to feed on them. And you'll find too, I think that's why the big bass like the wood structure near the deep water ledge. If they get a school, they're in a good ambush point by the wood where they're hidden. And the way that the bigger fish like to ambush, you won't see schools of 8 and 9 pound bass normally. Their bodies aren't adjusted for that. They're not small anymore, and they don't have the energy, or it's not they don't have the energy. They're so big, they'd rather just be ambush predators at that size. So they'll find those areas where the smaller bass are pushing fish in there to them and making it easy for them. And if you can find those areas, you'll consistently catch big bass there year after year after year. Like the big bass just figure out, that's where we need to be. My nose is itching like crazy again. Yeah, that's right. Natural state. Stripers will push the shad. Yeah, they'll push them to the surface too. That's another good point. It doesn't even have to be a ledge. If the bait fish are down at the bottom, the stripers will go down to the bottom and they'll drive them up because they're in a trap position at the surface. And that's where you see the birds diving on them because the stripers are underneath corralling them. All right. They're just circling them like orcas or something. And they're using their body basically as the schooling striper or the schooling hybrids are using themselves as the ledges. Then they talked about that at the Serious Angler podcast, and that was a good observation those guys had made. The fish will spread out and use themselves to corral the fish up, and then once they're up at the surface, they're entrapped, and then they take turns going up and feeding, and then you got the birds coming down feeding, kind of tipping you off as to what's going on. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. They like to single out, like, it's kind of like zebra camouflage. You guys familiar with how zebra camouflage works? When a zebra's in a herd, that black and white, they can't, when they're moving, they can't be singled out. And like the lions or jaguars, wherever they're hunting them, they can get trampled in there because they get confused. And they can't, that's Drew Gregory sending me a text right there. Glad to hear from him. They can't single out one zebra in that mess. And that's the same way schooling fish work. You know, they get into that school and not one of them can be singled out. So once one does get singled out, you'll find that is where the bass or the striper or the hybrid, they'll use their bodies to corral that fish and catch it because it's singled out. It's easy prey then. But when it's in the school, it's safe, just like the zebras. And I know that's true because I saw this study where some scientists ear tagged like cattle, zebras. They were doing some kind of zebra study, and they tagged the ears. Sorry about all the text messages. Boise's blowing me up. And the zebras with the tags got killed immediately because they were easy to be singled out by the predators. Just the tag on the ear gave it something to key in on and smoked them. You can't, any zebra that had a change in its body, a scar or a mark or anything like that, is easy kill, easy prey, just like an isolated fish. Oh, wow. There's a bunch coming through. Let's see here. Yeah, I hear you, Big Malone. Big Malone said he loves the lake. It's hard to grind out the skunks. Oh, well, Chrissy's coming in here and saying somebody tried to tell him that Florida strain bass prefer shallows and northerns prefer deep. Yeah, I don't know about that. That's maybe, I haven't seen any studies that prove that. You run into a lot of guys who they like to talk, because right now, I mean, out there's Florida strain, there's nothing but Florida strain bass in a lake behind me. And every single elite pro fisherman was fishing the ledge by the timber. They were not up on the edges. I know because I drove up and down the lake until I ran out of gas and then had to come back home on a trolling motor. I ran so many places and was marking all the places where Rick Clunn went and all those other guys out there. And they were not anywhere near the shallow water. They were out in here. I mean, you got to understand, 8 to 12 feet of water is deep in that lake. Good grief. I'm getting popular tonight. So no, I don't really think that one holds water. Plus these guys will tell you, oh, I can look at it and tell you it's a northern or a Florida. I can't. I need to take the, you need to do a fin clip or blood test and figure that out. And quite frankly, at this point, with the way F1s have been stocked, because F1 bass are not new. I mean, like ever since I've been stocking bass since 1996, we stocked F1s, and F1 is a cross between a northern and a Florida. So if that fish gets out during a flood down the emergency spillway into a stream down to the next lake and starts spawning with other bass, Florida genetics are being passed on. Now, are they pure Floridas? No, but there's still Florida genes in there. So as these genetic studies are being done, they're finding Florida genetics everywhere, all over the Southeast because of that, right? There's Florida genes everywhere. Are they pure Floridas? No, they're not, but they still have Florida genes in there. And those lakes have skinny, stunted bass because that's the part these dudes, I've said it once, I'll say it again. The genetics don't matter if the bass population is crowded, or if the crappie population is crowded, or if some other predatory fish in a bigger lake species is crowded and taking away food from the bass. The first thing you have to have is a balanced fishery. Then you need to worry about the genetics of the fish that you're stocking. The fish have to be growing before the genetics matter. Okay. If you take say you've got a lake full of pure northern bass that are 150 fish per acre because you stocked them that way and they're all 11 inches long, and you go take F1s and put them in there, and the best, like, go to Titan and buy the most expensive, the most perfectly genetically modified fish, from huge bass, and it's all perfect genes, and you put it in that stunted bass population. Those genetically superior fish will grow at the exact same rate as the northerns in that lake, because that is the forage base. That's the food that they have available. There's so many bass in there, they're feeding the forage base down, and they're all growing at the same rate or not growing at all, which is usually, or barely growing, right? So the genetics don't matter until the fishery's balanced, right? And that's just over these dudes' heads, because all they've heard on TV is, genetics. And so for me, whenever I hear these cats talking about genetics, it's like, okay, well, what's the balance of the fishery look like? What's the relative weight? What's the average relative weight of your fish that you've been catching for the last 3 or 4 years? And you get this, okay, you don't know what you're talking about. All right, now you got a pond like mine. Oh, well, our average relative weights are between 105 and 145%. Okay, well, now we can talk about genetics. Your average relative weight's 82%. Genetics don't mean a rip, crap, nothing, because the best genetic fish are going to be 82%, and the average old northern bass is going to be 82%. All right, you don't understand how this works when you're leading with genetics. All right, you got to lead with the balance. Once the balance of the fishery's good, then you can change it to the next. Had a good question come in today from a guy, stocked his pond with pure Floridas, and we had a discussion about how the pure Floridas, they don't bite as well. They're tricky. They're timid. They don't like weather changes. They get thrown off. Northern bass aren't nearly as finicky as Floridas. And this dude, because of TV, it's not his fault. Nobody talks about this stuff. That's why we have 11 people in here instead of 1,100 people talking about dumb crap on those other channels, because they don't listen. The genetics just don't matter until the balance is right. And these guys just want to sit around and talk about the genetics of the fish all day long. It would be the exact same thing. Let's use a different wildlife population. Let's use a deer population. Okay. And guess what? There's a carrying capacity for deer, right? And it's 40 deer per square mile. That's what the land holds. Okay. If you have 60, 70 deer per square mile, the bucks are not going to grow good horns. The browse is being picked over. You've got to go shoot a bunch of deer off of that You've got to get more acorns on the ground. You've got to get better browse to the deer. You've got to reduce that deer population, or you're going to have a bunch of small bucks because they're not consuming enough protein. They're not consuming enough nuts. They're not consuming enough browse to put on that massive rack. And, you know, guys seem to understand that when you're talking about deer populations, but it seems completely lost on them when you're talking about bass populations. It's kind of crazy. All right, I'm missing a bunch of questions. Let's skip down here and see what's going on. Yeah, that's how schooling fish work, man. Fish school because they're safer in a school. And like on your umbrella rigs or your A rigs or whatever, that dropper, right? Put that middle one a little bit further back from the group, and that's usually the one that gets smacked because it's the one that's out of the group. Not to say you won't catch some on the other ones, but generally speaking, if you drop one out pretty far, my nose is killing me tonight, boys. Yeah, that's a good question. No, Chris. Oh, wait. Nope, Dave. Sorry. I'm skipping. The advantage of the F1. Okay, so well, first thing we have to remember is climate change, right? There's a reason why you've got Florida bass surviving in Tennessee, like up in Chickamauga and stuff, because the winters aren't nearly as cold as they used to be, right? Florida bass are warm water fish. They evolved in Florida. I don't know if you saw the post on my page, but there's a native range showing it's not even all of Florida. The native range of Florida bass starts about where I am right here and goes south in central Florida. It doesn't even go really up into Georgia at all. Now, again, from stocking and bucket biologists and like ponds and stuff, Florida bass are all over the freaking place now. And also what you have to remember is they've just separated. It used to be subspecies. Northern bass were a subspecies in Florida bass, but they changed that. Now they're two different species of fish. They looked at the genetics. Genetic testing's gotten better, and they're going, actually, these fish are genetically different enough to be considered different species, right? So anytime you get a hybrid of most animals, you get what's called hybrid vigor, where they grow faster and get bigger than their parents. And that's exactly what an F1 is. You get the aggressiveness of a Northern, you get the big growth of a Florida. That's what they're getting at Chickamauga. They're stocking pure Floridas, but it's not the pure Floridas that are getting to the huge sizes. It's when those pure Floridas spawn with the fish that are in the lake already that are Northerns, they're creating F1s, and it's those F1s that are growing so big in Chickamauga. We're doing the same thing in the pond right now. We've got Northerns and Floridas in the pond. I've never had this much control over the genetics, but that was the goal. We get generations and generations and generations of F1s born in. Generally, when you stock a pond, you stock it with F1s, and those fish grow phenomenally. But when those fish spawn, you get an F2 generation, and that kind of reverts back to like a regular, like Northern bass type of growth. It doesn't grow like an F1. Nothing grows like an F1. So, yes, they grow bigger. They survive better. They're more aggressive. To give you an example, like the Northerns actually vastly outgrew the Floridas in the pond, like in real time in Sugar Hill Outdoors, the one that we've been tracking for a couple years. We got Northern fish coming up on 5 pounds, and the Floridas are like 2 pounds behind. They're coming up on 3, and we got them tagged so we can tell them apart. And that's kind of pretty normal because the pond is in North Georgia, and it's a pond. It's not Chickamauga, right? And it's a pattern I've seen over and over again. This is just the first time I've been able to document that. So their offspring are F1s, and we're seeing like 1.5 pounds growth on them, which we got 2 pounds of growth on the Northerns. But let's reverse that around. I've grown F1s, or I've stocked F1s initially. I've seen F1s go 2.5 pounds and 15 inches in 11 months, just absolutely crushing what we got out of our northern fish in this pond way faster. I've seen F1s go to 12 pounds, stocked at 35 per acre, to 12 pounds in 4 years. All right. You're not going to see that in Florida's. You're not going to see that in Northerns. That's not going to happen for you. Like, unless you go, like, again, way down to the 20, 18, 15 fish per acre rate, you might get that kind of growth. But again, you're dealing with a pond that you can barely catch any fish in, and that's no fun either. So I like the 35 pounds. I like the or 35 fish per acre and 12 pounds in 4 years, where you can actually go out and have a day of fishing where you're catching fish and catching big fish. All right. So that's the trade-off. That's what I'm doing. Could I get them to grow even faster? Yeah, I could, but it's no fun to fish there. Now, if it was my personal lake, I wouldn't mind it. But, I don't own a personal lake. I'm growing fish for other people. And if those people aren't catching fish, they're not happy with me, right? So there's a happy medium there. I've got to stock enough fish that makes it catchable for them and get good growth. So it's all a balancing act. All right, Josh has got one coming through. Largemouth at Beaver Dam. Electricity, they came out to 88 to 97 last June. I don't know what in reference to 88 to 97, what? Fish per acre? Or I'm not following you, Josh. In Virginia. Natural state. I'll go let Josh and skip this next one. I love the term bucket biologist. Yeah. Yeah, wrecking fisheries like crazy. You're right about that. Yeah, Dave, you getting it? It's simple, dude. It's not complex. Believe me, if this was this hard, I couldn't be doing it, But it seems like reverse logic because of the misinformation that we've been fed. And believe me, man, when I grew up, I mean, I have been bass fishing since 1978. I'm 51 years old. I can remember Man's jelly worms. My dad took me to a little pond near my grandma's house. I'm like 6, 7 years old. It's the late 70s. I've literally been bass fishing that long. And back then, like fishing with my grandpa's buddies. My grandpa had passed, but fishing with my grandpa's buddies, the fish went in the cooler, bro, and we caught big fish. But right in that time period is when those professional bass fishing tournaments fired up. And what was happening is those guys they still don't do a very good job. They've come a long way in their fish handling, but they still don't handle fish the way I prefer. But still, they killed the hell out of fish. And all the local fishermen were pissed off because all the dead bass floating around after the professional bass fishing tournament. So that's how catch and release was born. It was a PR issue to keep the bass fishing tournaments going. And they just kept, like trout, kept preaching catch and release, catch and release, catch and release. And now we're, let's see, 80, 90, 2010, 20, going into 40, 50 years of misinformation being pumped into everybody's head because they had the biggest platform, right? And they're a business to make money, and they just keep, they keep beating the same drum and making this to make money. And again, this is highly variable, and we can go into like 2 more hours of discussion on that crap. But at the end of the day, it's like guys are taking that and applying it everywhere, and they shouldn't be. And that's the whole reason why I started my page, was to teach people this is how you measure a bass, and this is how you tell if you need to keep it, because you need to keep it sometimes. And most places, Midwest, what's up, my man? Good to have you in. I've been running my mouth. I don't know why my nose itches like this. It has something to do with my health issues. Been going at it with the doctors. Oh, I see something. Yeah, they get growth like that in Mexico. Now, in Mexico, again, variables, Chris. You got like a 12-month growing season. You've got a place where there's tilapia, but you've also got in those lakes down there where there's tilapia, you've got massive amounts of commercial gill netting, fishing, where those guys are pulling those tilapia for food constantly down there. You've got a completely unique situation compared to what we've got going here. And you've got a completely different mindset down there. You've got guys keeping fish left and right down there. Any anglers that are catching fish, those people they're not Americans. It's not the same thing. And they don't play by the rules of throw the fish back, right? So hell yeah, they got bigger fish in Mexico. They got a longer growing season. They got a completely different forage base, and they've got heavy harvest. So, comparing Mexico to American lakes. Now, you take those Mexican lakes and those ideas, those are the ideas that I'm applying to my ponds, right? They are harvested. We already started harvesting in Sugar Hill Outdoors, pulling 30 bass out of there this year. Frank, I've got some F1 logmouths for sure. No doubt about it. Let's see. Uh-oh. Frank's on the big fish. No more dinks for him. No more pan. No more. What do you boys call them? Sunnies up there? You been on the sunnies? Seeing some bluegill, seeing some crappie on Frank's page. And bass opens in a month. Golly, man, that's a short season. Yeah, I bet those pike don't let those bass overcrowd. We do have some decent walleye fishing around a couple of deeper lakes in Georgia. They'll stock some walleye. We got enough depth to keep them. And Carter's Lake is a super deep lake in North Georgia that has some decent walleye fishing a couple times a year. No doubt. Oh, I missed one by solar. If money's no object, well, and here's the thing, solar. I don't like money is like dudes throw money like that Bama Bass dude is just throwing money at his pond, but he's not getting any better growth than I'm getting. As a matter of fact, he overstocked it anyway, and he's going to find his bass are going to stunt pretty quick at the rate he's stocked. And I don't follow him that closely. I get a little feedback from people who do follow him. I tried to contact him and talk to him, but he never returned anything from me. So I think he's a good example of a rookie. He's got plenty of money. He's got a great following. He got 1 million followers over there following his pond. I mean, I'm not trying to hate on the dude at all. I'm proud of him. He actually inspires me to keep going, because if he can get 1 million followers, I certainly can too, doing the same daggone thing. But if I had a personal pond, if I hit the lottery tomorrow and I'm building myself a pond, it's going to be between 25 and probably 50 acres. You need a pond about that size to throw off enough big bass to make it. Not to say I can't grow big bass in smaller bodies of water. I'm just saying where it's really, really good, it's going to be in that probably 35 to 50 acre range. I don't really want it to be any bigger than that, because it gets to the point once it's bigger than that, even if I have an electrofishing boat and something gets out of whack, I can't get enough fish out of there to fix it, right? I need a massive amount of effort. And that's another thing dudes don't understand. Like, they see a dude over there with 6 bass on a stringer and they think he's ruined the bass population. It's like, shut the hell up. I don't even know what you're talking about. it takes, I mean, if your bass population gets, just put it this way, if your bass population gets stunted, you got to remove 21-pound bass per acre per year for 2 to 3 years. So if you have a 100-acre lake, 21 pounders on 100 acres is 2,001 pounders. Who catches that many fish? You know, you need bass clubs coming out there, right? Now, if I've got a 20-acre lake and I need to keep 21 pounders, that's 400 fish. Well, that's a doable, that's me and a couple buddies, and especially if I got an electric fishing boat, no problem. I can go, that's something manageable, right? But once you get up to over 100 acres, 200 acres, 300 acres stunted, it's stunted. It ain't changing. Mother Nature might change it for you, but the dudes that are they're doing catch and release, man, they ain't helping you at all. You're not going to ever harvest. You're not going to take enough bass out to change the balance. So I'm not stocking forage. I haven't stocked any forage in Sugar Hill Outdoors aside from the initial fish that I stocked. I don't stock fish that way. You can't feed bass to get them to grow. Bill Gates doesn't have enough money to do that, much less anybody else. It's just stupid waste of money. The only thing you're doing is paying the guys who are selling crawfish, paying the guys who are selling shad. I'm not saying that I don't add different varieties and stuff. I'm just saying in a 25-acre pond, I can grow you some absolute units on bass and bluegill. I don't need a diverse forage base. I've done it. I need feeder. I need some bluegill, a few red ear, and some bass, and I'll grow you some absolute units, right? I don't have to spend a bunch of money stocking forage. Where that comes from is sports writers who get paid by fish hatcheries because fish hatcheries are in the business to sell things to people. So they write these articles. They talk about all these different species of fish that they've stocked, and it pays them it's about money. It's not about, again, I'm talking about a measurable difference, right? And I can promise you, because I've already done it like a bunch of times. You take Sugar Hill Outdoors, we could have stocked thread fins every year. We could have stocked, I can't stock tilapia, but if I could have stocked tilapia. I could have stocked crawfish in there. I could have spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on forage. And I can promise you there would be no measurable difference in the relative weight of the fish versus what they are right now, because I'm just feeding them on bluegill. And I've watched so many guys do it. It doesn't work. And it's definitely like, even if it does work a tiny little bit, the tiny little bit that you get out of it isn't worth the money. Your money's much better spent on feed, consistently feeding, high protein feed. Don't stock anything. Feed those bluegill up, and you'll have great bass growth. Just like I said, there's a lot of misinformation, and in that situation, it has to do with profit more than it has to do with growing big bass. Oh, let me put the thing up here. Midwest is talking about something. Still hooking dinks. Yeah. I don't do great during the pre-spawn myself. Midwest. Every once in a while I'll catch a big one, but it's usually after the spawn. What's Frank into? Went after pike. I did pretty good on rattle traps on pike, but I've only been fishing for them a few times. Josh is saying keep 12 inchers. Yeah, the thing about it is to think about it this way. Once bass are over 16 inches, they get really good at feeding on smaller bass. So if you go to a lake and you have one of those places where you get on a good day and it's 20, 25, 30, 35, all 1 pound bass, that's a clue you don't have any 8 pound bass, because 8 pound bass will absolutely smoke a 1 pound bass. So if you've just got these piles and piles and piles of 1 pound bass, there's your first clue that you don't have very many eights, because the 1 pound bass wouldn't be there if you did. I saw some stingrays today at the coast. They came swimming by. Saw a manatee, big manatee today. Saw some sheep's head, a couple red drum. It was pretty fun. Yeah, thanks, Big Malone, man. Appreciate you. Well, we're running it on an hour and 45, and appreciate you guys being here. If there's any more questions, throw them up there real quick. I'll chill for one more second, but I'm hungry, man. I'm gonna go. I think I'm gonna go make a steak. I'm feeling like a steak tonight, and I've been out in the sun. I got all sunburned today. Maybe get some aloe. Pike like the Flash? Yeah, I agree, man. I did really good on the chrome trap with the blue back up there. Spoons, inline spinners, and spinner baits are all winners on the pike. Yeah. The snot rockets like the chrome. Thanks, Solar Man. Appreciate you joining in, talking with us tonight, my friend. Natural State, appreciate you. Thanks for joining. Hope it helps. I did it on Friday. I don't think Red went live tonight. I texted him and he didn't text back, so he's probably busy. So I took his spot. Don't want to block him. You want a last minute post spawn tip, Chrissy? Sure. Find the deep water ledges like we talked about. They're going to move out. They're going to be looking to feed. Go to the wood structure near the ledge. That's where they're going to be most of the time. I don't know why. And I don't know, Chrissy, do you know how to read a topo map? And you look at your maps, if you look at a topo map of the bottom of the lake, right? I wish I had one. I don't have one here. I'll print one out next time and we'll talk about it more in depth. But where the lines are far apart on a topo map for the bottom of the lake, that's a gradual slope. And where the lines get really close together, that's a ledge. That's a steeper slope. Okay. So when you're looking at the map, if you've never been at the lake before or the pond before, if you can get a topo map of it, watch where the lines are really close together. Those are the ledges. Okay. So say you have a shallow water, let's just say the screen is a lake, right? And to make it easy, either side is shallow. So the lines are far apart. We have a line. Let me get my hands right here. No, let me get this hand. It's backwards because of this stupid thing. So we have a line and then a line and then a line, and they're far apart. So that indicates a big shallow water flat. And usually what it'll be a line, it'll say 2, that's 2 feet, and everything between here and there is about 2 feet, right? And then another line, and that's 4 feet. So you know from here to here, it goes from 2 to 4 feet. But then when the lines start getting really close together, that indicates a ledge going that way. Or my hand's backwards, that way. Where the lines are close together is the ledge. Okay, so look for the wood where the lines are close together, but also remember that line, say that line goes like that, right? Well, that means this whole area is shallow and then it gets deeper this way because the lines indicate the ledge. So that ledge is like a highway. Okay. And the bass are going to move up and down it. Bass love, all right, let's just change the map and say this is the surface of the water and this is the bottom of the lake, right? Bass love to be near a place where they can get deeper just by doing this. Okay. They don't want to have to swim a freaking 100 yards to get deeper into the water, usually. Now, that's not to say there's some bass that always live in shallow water, because they do. There's been some new studies on that on YouTube and stuff. Some bass will live in shallow water all the time. Some bass will live on nothing banks by a rock all the time. But just generally speaking, where the lines get close together on the topo map is like a highway. So if I had to fish anywhere post spawn, I would follow where the lines are bunched together. I would just run my boat up and down that with crankbaits, with worms, with all kinds of baits that'll get down on that ledge, fish that ledge, because that's generally where the fish are going to be traveling, just like an interstate. Frank says pink is a good color for pike. Interesting. You ever throw methylate trick worms at them? But that methylate might work. To put it on a wire leader, I guess. But I don't know. I like pike. I had a good time catching them. I know like people up north sometimes don't like them, but I had fun. Anyway, I hope that helps you guys. And yeah, same thing, Josh. Hydrilla, where the water goes from shallow to deep. You find the weed edge. You know what I mean? Instead of it being a wood edge, it's a weed edge where you got that thick weeds and then it drops off deep. That ledge right there, that's an easy way to find them. Yep. The trap god, Bill Lewis. Chris says the Sunny's coming off the beds first week in June. Yeah. Top water fires up. That's cool, man. Sounds about right to me. All right, boys, I'm about to starve. I've been in the sun all day and I'm getting a steak, and I appreciate you. And we'll be back in a week or so. Take her easy.